Hello everyone, my name is Kang from Southwest Jiaotong University, Chengdu, China. I'm very happy to have a chance to give a presentation about our research progress here. And thanks a lot for the kind invitation of the organizers. My presentation is about the damage mechanism presented in the uniaxial low cycle fatigue of an extruded magnesium alloy with addressing the contribution of ratchetting. The co-authors include Professor Shenchuan Wu and two PhD students Ziyi Wang and Yu Lei. The contents of this presentation are divided into 4 parts, including knowledge background, experimental procedures, results and discussions, and finally the conclusions. At first, I would like to introduce the research background of this work. As a chemical element, the contents of the magnesium in the air's crust ranks the 8th, and the magnesium resources on the airs are very abundant. As a material, the magnesium and its alloys are the lightest metallic structural materials now, so magnesium alloys show a great potential in the lightweight design of structure and energy saving. At present, magnesium alloy has been used to cars, trains, aircrafts, and other fields, but most of them are only used as a secondary load-bearing parts like this. However, according to calculations, the weight of a high-speed train could be reduced by 13% if the main load-bearing parts of the vehicle body are made of magnesium alloys. Recently, the wrought magnesium alloys have excellent mechanical properties, which makes them can be applied in these loading-bearing components. However, such components are often subject to a cyclic loading in service, which will cause the fatigue fracture. So, the fatigue of the magnesium alloys should be considered in advance. Since magnesium alloys have a HCP crystal structure, field slip systems can be activated. So, to accommodate the corresponding plastic deformation, the deformation twinning, another plastic deformation mechanism, plays an important role. In addition, because of the basal texture introduced in the manufacture process and the polarity of the twin, the raw magnesium alloy exhibits a tension compression asymmetry, as shown in these figures. That is, if the alloy is compressed along its Z-axis, the plastic deformation is dominated by the dislocation slipping, which exhibits a higher yield stress. However, if the alloy is stretched along its Z-axis, the plastic deformation is controlled by the extension twinning, which exhibits much lower yield stress. Besides the twinning and the dislocation slipping, the detwinning of formed twin will occur during the reverse tensile loading stage of cyclic tension compression, which results in a unique S-shaped hysteresis loop, as shown in this figure. In summary, the cyclic plasticity and corresponding low cycle fatigue of magnesium alloys are very complicated, and much more effort should be paid to study them. In part 2, I will introduce the experimental procedures of this work. The experimental material is a commercial extruded AZ31 magnesium alloy. After extrusion, the material exhibits a strong basal texture, that is, the grains show the ring-shaped distribution as shown in this figure. During the monotonic loading along the extruded direction, the compressive yielding stress of the alloy is much lower than its tensor one as shown in this figure. This is because the dislocation slipping dominated the plastic deformation in tension, while the extension turning dominated it in compression. Therefore, to explore the effects of the turning and the dislocation slipping on the fatigue damage of the alloy, the stress-controlled loading level is designed according to the tensile and compressive yielding stresses, so that the peak and volume stresses are higher than or lower than the corresponding yield stresses. And then, various plastic deformation mechanisms can be activated simultaneously or after the fatigue tests. We carry out a multi-scale experimental observation to reveal the damage mechanism of the alloy. First, the tested samples are observed by using a set of in situ test rigs attached to the Shanghai synchrotron radiation facility and developed by our group. In the process of synchrotron tomography, the observed samples are stretched so that the crack is opened, and then the EBSD and TEM observations are further performed to detect the twins and dislocations. Moreover, some slices cut from the test samples are used for the damage evolution observation by using OM and SEM. The synchrotron radiation X-ray is a high-energy electromagnetic wave emitted by light-speed electrons. Using this X-ray, we can perform the in situ high-resolution and non-destructive exploration inside the materials to obtain two-dimensional slices of defect morphology. Then, through a specific software, these two-dimensional slices are rearranged into a three-dimensional image of the defects. Finally, the evolution of such defects can be summarized from the in situ observation. In the next, I would like to display the results and discussions. At first, the details of obtained results. We conduct some fatigue tests of extruded AZ31 magnesium alloy under the symmetrical stress-controlled cyclic loading condition and with different stress amplitudes. And the obtained hysteresis loops and the evolutions of peak and volume strains are shown in this figure. It is seen that because the cycloplastic deformation of the alloy in these prescribed cases is dominated by the turning-deturning, since the peak stress is lower than the tensile yield stress, the hysteresis loop is basically symmetric, but the peak and volume strains evolve towards different directions at different moving rates, and a ratcheting occurs in the compressive direction even in the symmetrical stress-controlled cyclical test, which are different from that observed in the FCC and BCC metals. From these figures, we can also see that the hysteresis loops become narrower and narrower, which implies that the alloy shows a remarkable cyclical hardening feature, and the fatigue life decreased monotonically with increasing the stress amplitude. Then we consider the cases with the Nonzero mean stresses are positive and relative high, that is 18, 100, 120, and 140 MPa. In these cases, the peak stresses are much higher than the tensile yielding stress, but the volume stresses are much lower than the compressive yield stress. So the plastic deformation is only dominated by the dislocation slipping. Therefore, the cyclic plasticity of the loi is similar to that of BCC and FCC metals here. And the hysteresis loops are elongated and symmetric. Both the peak and volume stress involved towards the tensile direction and remarkable ratcheting occurs. In these cases, the fatigue life of the loi decreases as the mean stress increases, especially when the mean stress is 140 MPa. The significant ratchetting strain shortens the fatigue life remarkably. When the mean stress is said to be negative, since the peak stress is lower than the tensile yield stress, the plastic deformation here is dominated by the twinning-detwinning mechanism. So, the hysteresis loops is basically symmetric. The peak strain evolves towards the compressive direction, while the volume strain first moves to the tensile direction and then back to the compressive direction. An obverse compressive ratcheting occurs, and the fatigue life decreases as the compressive mean stress increases. When the positive mean stress is lower, both the peak and volume stresses exceed the corresponding yielding stresses. Thus, the dislocation slipping and twinning-detwinning will occur alternately, and the hysteresis loop becomes obversely asymmetric. The evolution of peak and volume stresses is different from that in the previous cases, and depends on the magnitude of mean stress. When the mean stress is very low, for example 20 and 30 MPa, although the mean stress is positive, the peak and volume strains were involved in the compressive direction. But when the mean stress is 50 MPa, the peak and volume strains then evolve in the tensile direction. From all the fatigue tests, a specific non-monotonic relation is seen between the fatigue life and applied mean stress, as shown in this figure. It results from the alternately activated plastic deformation mechanisms. Thus, to reveal the damage mechanisms of the loi with 3 plastic deformation modes, we further characterize the damage samples to clarify the damage mechanisms. We choose 3 typical loading conditions for the synchrotron tomography and microscope observations, that is, the TDD, TDSD, and SD deformation modes. From the obtained results, we find that there is a significant differences in the number of the cracks, as marked in yellow or red in these figures. A lot of cracks are found in the TDSD mode, while the number of cracks is reduced in the TDD mode. In the SD mode, only a single or 2 cracks are observed. In the TDD mode, multiple fatigue cracks exist, and the cracks tend to be merged at the crack tips by local shearing. In the TDSD mode, because of the large number of cracks, the average distance among the cracks becomes smaller. They are more likely to merge by local shearing. In the TDD mode, the damage evolution observations by OM and SCM show that the number of twins keeps increasing in the first 500 cycles, but after that, it no longer increases, which means that the plastic deformation is accumulated in the twins, and therefore a twin boundary damage is observed in the later stage of fatigue tests. Nevertheless, the physical short cracks are found to be grain boundary cracks. Next, we check the main crack. It is found that the crack is sometimes intergranular and sometimes transgranular. When it is transgranular, it is affected by the twin boundary damage, leading to a zigzag path failure. In the TDSD mode, the number of twins and slip bands keeps increasing in the first 120 cycles, but doesn't change too much after that, indicating the accumulation of twin boundary damage and slip band damage. Moreover, comparing to the TDD mode, more grain boundary cracks are detected in this sample, but the twin boundary crack caused by the twin boundary damage is also observed. By checking the main crack in the TDSD mode, it is found that apart from grain boundary cracks, the crack path is strongly affected by twin boundary damage and slip band damage, leading to a zigzag path. In the SD mode, it is surprising to find that the intergranular crack is not detected. The number of slip bands does not stop increasing until 2,500 cycles, and the slip band damage is finally detected in the later stage of fatigue tests. Similarly, there is also the zigzag crack path in the SD mode, owing to the slip band damage, especially in Figure D. The crack path is along the grain boundary, but affected by the slip band, leading to a zigzag path. Moreover, the slip band crack is found in Figure G, which is a result of slip band damage. From the OM and SEM observations, the following damage features can be summarized for the three samples of the alloy with different deformation modes. Next, to further review the damage mechanism of the alloy during the low cycle fatigue, the damaged samples are characterized in the micro scale. EBSD analysis is first carried out. We count the twin flexion in the three samples. It is found that the TDD mode has the highest twin flexion, and the TDSD has the second, but in the SD mode there is basically no twin. When we compared the misorientations of the four samples, including the as extruded one, we found that a dispersed peak appears near the misorientation of 86 degrees in the TDD and TDSD modes, indicating the extension twinning boundary. That is, the higher the peak value is, the more twins the sample has. From this figure, we can see that, compared with the as extruded sample, the TDD has much more twins, but the dislocation density is basically the same. In the TDSD, apart from more twins, the dislocation density also significantly. Besides EBSD, we also carry out the TEM observation to investigate the dislocation structures and examine the dislocation type. Previous C+A dislocations are found in the TDSD and SD modes near the grain boundary because of stress concentration. In addition, the extrusion trace is observed at the trim boundary in the TDD mode, which means that the trim boundary will cause small severe string incompatibility. We will discuss this phenomenon later. The TM result shows that the dislocation density in the TDD mode is low, and a network structure is formed by the relatively straight basal dislocation. In the TDSD mode, the dislocation density is higher than that of TDD mode. Some curved non-basal dislocation appears, and a few of dislocation tangles are detected. However, in the SD, the dislocation density becomes much higher, and a large number of non-basal dislocations and dislocation tangles are found. Okay, the damage mechanism of the lower is then discussed under the 3 deformation modes. It is well known that the plastic deformation will cause the surface extrusion intrusion, leading to a stress concentration and self-crack initiation. Therefore, we first examine the effect of the accumulated plastic strain. According to the experiments, it can be seen that the accumulated plastic strain is the highest in the TDD mode, the second in the TDSD mode, and the lowest in the SD mode. That is, the surface roughness in the TDSD and TDD mode is higher, and the cracks are easy to initiate in multiple sites, while the accumulated plus deformation in the SD mode is relatively small and the surface is relatively smooth. Once the crack initiates, it will glow unstably, resulting in main cracks. Microscopically, the most essential differences among the 3 samples is the participation of twinning or not. So the effect of extension twinning must be addressed. From the EBSD result in the TDD mode, we can calculate that for basal slip, the Smith factor differences between the twin and the matrix is about 0.2, and for the prismatic slip, it is about 0.3. That is, this is a relatively high deformation incompatibility between the 2 regions, which will cause a stress concentration at the twin boundary and lead to additional twinning boundary cracks in the TDD and TDSD modes. The dislocation structures are also different in the 3 samples. In the TDSD mode, both peripheral twins and the C+A dislocations are formed, and the number of cracks is the largest. So, besides the twin boundary crack, there must be an additional crack initiation mechanism. Because the CRSS of the C+A dislocation is extremely high, its formation would result in a high intergranular stress, which is different from the released intergranular stress by the formation of twins. Therefore, the above 2 processes will lead to a redistribution of intergranular stress, leading to additional damage along the grain boundary. Finally, more grain boundary cracks appear in the TDSD mode. Finally, we will give the conclusions of this work. At first, a unique cyclic plasticity and specific mean stress-dependent fatigue life are observed, which result from the interaction of various plastic deformation mechanisms. Then, the damage mechanism involved in the local fatigue of the lower is summarized as following. Of course, there is still a lot of work can be carried out, such as the following three aspects. By the way, the content of this presentation has been published. You can find the details about the related explanation and discussion in the two papers. Thanks for your attention.